My name is Jelena Madir, and I'm the General Counsel of Gavi, the Vaccine Alliance, a nonprofit public-private partnership. At the beginning of the pandemic, Gavi was entrusted with quite a daunting task of leading on the procurement and delivery of vaccines workstream of a program set up by WHO. And the specific billion-dollar question that we were tasked with answering was, how can we make sure that COVID-19 vaccines, when they become available, are distributed in a fair and equitable manner, so as to avoid the situation where they're only available to a handful of wealthy countries that have managed to enter into bilateral deals with manufacturers. In response to this billion-dollar challenge, we created a Covax facility whose purpose was to be a global program for the development, production, and distribution of COVID vaccines. We were guided by three overarching objectives. First, trying to incentivize manufacturers to expand vaccine production capacity while they were still developing their vaccines. And what do I mean by this? As you may know, manufacturers are typically reluctant to risk making significant investments that are needed to scale up vaccine manufacturing facilities until they have received approval for a vaccine. But if we had waited for that, that would have led to significant delays and even greater shortages of vaccines than what we ended up seeing. So to avoid this, Gavi, on behalf of Covax facility, ended up entering into advanced purchase commitment agreements with manufacturers, where we were basically telling manufacturers, we guarantee to you the acquisition of X number of doses, so go ahead and scale up your production. Another goal of Covax was to guarantee fair and equitable access to COVID vaccines for every country in the world in order to avoid situations where vaccines were available only to a handful of high-income countries that had entered into bilateral agreements with manufacturers. And the third goal of Covax was to develop the largest and most diverse actively managed portfolio of COVID vaccine candidates in order to maximize the probability of success so that the best vaccines were ultimately made available. How does it work? High-income countries and upper-middle-income countries are self-financing participants in the facility, and they were required to pay for their doses. Then we had a group of 92 low-income and lower-middle-income countries which could participate in the facility with the support from donors who were providing donation funding. Gavi, as the administrator of this facility, was entering into agreements with numerous manufacturers to secure access to vaccine supply on the basis that only appropriately approved vaccine doses would be procured through the facility. And what do I mean by appropriately approved? In order to be included in the Covax portfolio, the vaccine had to be either pre-qualified by WHO or licensed by one of the so-called stringent regulatory authorities. The one question we often get asked is why we included high-income countries in the mix. And the reason we wanted to have wealthy self-financing countries in the program is because Covax was set up at a time when there was no available vaccine and no one knew when it would become available. What we did know is that when the vaccine became available, high-income countries would compete for it with the low-income countries. So the thinking was that it would be good for high-income countries to have some skin in the game in this program as well. And the reason it was attractive for rich countries to participate in Covax at this time is because while they were striking bilateral deals with a handful of manufacturers, no one knew which vaccine candidates were ultimately going to be successful. And the unique selling point of Covax was that it would offer you access to a larger pool of vaccine candidates than any country could probably access on its own. As I will explain in the next couple of slides, structuring a deal that works for these self-financing participants and at the same time doesn't expose Gavi as an organization to huge risks was by far the most challenging aspect of the facility. In terms of contractual structure, as you can see from the diagram, there are several key steps in the structure. First, for each country, Gavi entered into a commitment agreement, and typically with the Ministry of Health of the relevant country. The agreement specified the number of doses of approved vaccines which the country was committed to purchase. Pursuant to this agreement, the country made a non-refundable down payment to Gavi. In addition, and I will say a few more words about this in a second when I address key risks, the country's Ministry of Finance or a commercial bank provided a financial guarantee to Gavi. Step 2 entails Gavi utilizing a down payment for the countries to enter into advanced purchase commitment agreements with manufacturers. And the aim of these agreements was to secure sufficient doses of approved vaccines so that each country could receive enough doses commensurate with its commitment. In step 3, Gavi allocates approved vaccines to the relevant country. And in its notification of allocation, Gavi also directs the country to enter into the actual supply agreement with either a procurement agent, and this would be UNICEF or Pan American Health Organization, or the manufacturer directly. And in step 4, the country complies with its obligation to enter into the supply agreement with the manufacturer, pursuant to which the manufacturer is then obliged to deliver the approved vaccine to the country. The conceptualization and operational aspects of the Covax facility were enabled by Gavi's in-house lawyers and our external law firm, Linklaters. Lawyers got involved at the very inception and creation of the Covax facility by guiding business teams through the maze of legal risks inherent in the complex structure and proposing appropriate mitigants. Specifically, we drafted terms and conditions for the Covax facility and created templates for commitment agreements with governments, for guarantees from governments and commercial banks, and for advance purchase agreements with vaccine manufacturers. We also negotiated with key stakeholders. On the one hand, we had to explain complex concepts to clients with different levels of sophistication. On the other hand, we tried to negotiate best possible deal for low-income countries with vaccine manufacturers, which often had an upper hand because of the scarcity of supply and high demand for their product. Moreover, lawyers were heavily involved in strategy setting and implementation in close partnership with internal business teams, often taking the lead on negotiations of numerous agreements that prop up the structure, including, among others, commitment agreements with over 150 governments, guarantee agreements with a number of finance ministries and commercial banks, advance purchase agreements with a number of pharmaceutical companies, including Pfizer, AstraZeneca, Serum Institute of India, Moderna, Novavax, J&J, procurement agreements with UNICEF and Pan American Health Organization, and insurance arrangements to protect Gavi against sovereign default risk. Lawyers played a key role in trying to find solutions to mitigate numerous risks that the Covax structure posed to Gavi. First, there was the country default risk. And this was the risk of self-financing participants not paying for the doses on time or not paying at all, while Gavi would still have to comply with its commitment to pay for the doses to manufacturers. In terms of mitigants, we started off by requesting countries to provide a guarantee from a commercial bank of international standing or a multilateral development bank. However, in practice, this would have taken a significant amount of time, so we ended up accepting guarantees from the country's ministries of finance, which of course is something because the commitment agreement was typically signed by the Ministry of Health, which doesn't hold the purse strings, whereas the Ministry of Finance does. But this type of guarantee still exposed us to the same type of sovereign risk. So then, with the assistance of Citibank, which was our financial advisor, we ended up getting default insurance from a commercial insurer. Another risk stemmed from the fact that Gavi was acting as an intermediary, but we were not the ones actually supplying vaccines. So ultimately, manufacturers were required to enter into supply agreements with countries directly or through our procurement agent. And what would happen if they failed to do so? Well, this could have resulted in doses not being delivered to the countries and Gavi still having to pay firmly committed doses to manufacturers. So in terms of possible mitigants, we tried to agree on key terms and conditions of supply arrangements in our own advance purchase agreements with manufacturers so that there were no surprises for countries as to what manufacturers were asking for. Another big challenge was that when we started negotiating advance purchase agreements, we were negotiating very much in the supplier market, and we were unable to get firm supply schedules from manufacturers. And this would obviously be a key provision in any regular supply contract. But manufacturers themselves didn't know whether and when they were going to have a successful vaccine product, so they couldn't commit to delivering it to COVAX by a particular date. In addition, many manufacturers had tiered pricing, and they were giving a lower price to low-income countries, which makes perfect sense. But that also meant that once vaccines did become available, many manufacturers ended up taking a commercial decision to prioritize wealthy countries in their supply schedules because they were paying a higher price. And that, of course, has been extremely problematic. And we tried a few things here. First, we were putting pressure on manufacturers to be more transparent with their order timelines, and we tried to make them understand that by making business decisions not to prioritize supply to Covax, they were not prioritizing supply to the majority of the world's population, which ironically in the long run impacts virus transmission in the world and has an impact on wealthy countries' economies. We also introduced slot swapping. So if high-income countries were ahead of Covax in the supply queue and didn't need the doses, we tried to convince them to step back and let Covax take their place in the queue. And finally, we introduced dose donation program, whereby wealthy countries could donate their excess doses to Covax. And that was not easy either, because we struggled to have those donations be more predictable and be arranged for those vaccines that have long enough of a shelf life so that we could organize transportation and distribution to the countries once a high-income country had decided to donate them. Finally, another huge issue that we encountered was that manufacturers were saying that they would only supply to countries that had a satisfactory liability regime. Basically, manufacturers were requesting that they be exempt from civil liability for unexpected adverse side effects, and they wanted countries to indemnify them for any claims in relation to serious side effects. Where we've landed is that for the 92 poorest countries that were funded by donations, after lots of blood, sweat, and tears, Gavi's lawyers managed to negotiate a model indemnity clause that a number of manufacturers signed up to. In addition, because manufacturers were saying that an indemnity from a poor country was not worth much to them, and there was no commercial insurer that was going to provide insurance to a country for this type of liability, we ended up setting up a no-fault compensation fund through WHO, which is available to individuals from those 92 poorest countries, where you can go and claim compensation without having to prove fault through lengthy court proceedings. The benefits of the no-fault compensation scheme include simplified access to compensation, as well as avoiding a lengthy, costly, and complex encounter with a legal system with no guarantee of success. And this was the first international no-fault compensation scheme. Ultimately, the biggest challenge with this project is that we put together something that had not been done before, so in many ways it was precedent-setting. And despite all the obstacles that we faced, we ended up delivering nearly 2 billion doses to about 150 countries. Let me conclude by saying a few words about scalability and lessons learned. The COVAX facility will be the template for global risk-sharing arrangements going forward. It will be the basis on which the world prepares for the next pandemic and could also help with other issues that the world is grappling with, such as climate change. It is scalable because it tries to find a solution not only for low-income countries, which were donor-funded, but also caters to high-income countries and upper-middle-income countries, which were participating on the self-financing basis and were required to pay for their vaccine doses through COVAX. One could imagine a similar setup for a climate change fund, which would require the polluter countries to pay for their emissions, for example. And what are the lessons learned and what can be done to anticipate crises in the future and prepare for them? Well, the biggest hindrance for the successful rollout of the global vaccine program has been vaccine nationalism and the hoarding of vaccines by high-income countries. And we can, of course, agree that this is not helpful because in the long run, it hurts the global economy. However, I think that future iterations of COVAX and similar programs will simply have to take into account national interests in the design from the beginning. We simply need to assume that government leaders will prioritize their own populations and work with that, and perhaps get vaccine manufacturers to commit that they will allocate certain percentage of supply to a global program like COVAX by certain dates. Another issue was that we didn't have money up front and had to spend a lot of time fundraising. And what we're doing now is looking at ways in which money could be put into a central fund that could potentially be available as a global pandemic funding mechanism, but in a way that ensures that we are not just adding another layer of bureaucracy that ultimately creates unnecessary delays when fast response is needed. We clearly need to have funding rapidly available for the next pandemic. So we are looking at the most efficient ways to achieve this through, for example, so-called contingency pledges to global agencies like Gavi that would be triggered only when the disaster strikes, enabling those agencies to respond quickly. And finally, another area that we are looking at is increasing of manufacturing capacity. Clearly, during a pandemic, you need several times more doses of a vaccine than are normally produced. Manufacturing facilities are predominantly concentrated in developed countries, which has played into vaccine hoarding through export bans and has hindered equitable access. So clearly, there is a need to increase global manufacturing capacity to achieve greater geographical diversity, so that all regions have access. And this, of course, sounds good in theory, but vaccine manufacturing facilities can cost more than $500 million to build, and it's not a viable business model if there is a chance that these facilities would sit idle in between crises. So what we're looking at now is at the transfer of technologies to build facilities that are geared towards increasing the supply of non-pandemic vaccines, in other words, those that are used in routine immunization programs, but in a way that those facilities could quickly be pivoted towards the production of pandemic vaccines when needed.